back like we never left. It's Double Move Sports. As always, I'm Stef Albiero. I'm here with the fantasy phenom, Alex Lott, and we're back. We are actually back. We had to take a week off because we're in the in-season grind. Now, we were keeping up with our boys in the Discord. Shout out to all the homies rocking with us in there. We got a lot of questions from that Discord channel that we're going to address today, but the primary focus of today's episode is going to be getting everyone ready for the fantasy football playoffs. I know last week for a few leagues, Week 14 was the initial week of the fantasy football playoffs. Hopefully it wasn't in your league and you've adapted to that 17-game season now. But in every league, this is playoff time. At this point, Week 15, 16, 17 is when you're going to win championships. We've helped people do that over the last 2 seasons now. Excited to see even more trophies drop in. But Alex, you ready to get into this playoff primer for 2021?
I'm hyped, Steph. I'm honestly hyped to be back. I mean, we were just talking before the show, too. Like, the playoffs in fantasy football, things change. We build these perceptions over what happens the first 4 weeks, the first 8 weeks, and that kind of, like, crafts our entire mindset on players, our opinion on teams, on offenses, on defenses. But what we see time and time again in fantasy football, starters go down, players get hurt, players miss time, players start to fade, guys come out of the woodwork to be league winners. And that's why I'm honestly just so excited. We're back this week with the playoff primer. You said it best. In the Discord, we've been rocking in there with that tight-knit part of the community. If you've been following along, like, join that Discord in the link below. That is where you have the best access to Steph and I. Like, we did have to take that week off. We have work, we have jobs, we try to keep this thing going the best we can, but we want to keep this going for the long haul. So we just had to stick to the Discord last week, and we were able to get a lot of people in there to the playoffs. So you know who you are in the Discord. Shout out to you, but totally free to join. So rock with us in there if you haven't already. But Steph, I don't only want to make the playoffs in my fantasy football leagues. I want to win championships. I'm sure a lot of people tuning in do as well. So that's why what we're talking about today is going to be absolutely crucial, not only with league winners at this point. Some might be sneaky, some might be a little less sneaky, and then also key start-sit decisions as we come down the stretch.
Now, we talked about this a little bit before mid-season. It was league winners that you could go out and acquire, and those were primarily running backs. And I think that mindset is still the same. Now, we're seeing the Javonte Williams. I'll take a victory lap on him. Okay, he is turning out to be one of those playoff time league winners, hitting his stride right when you need him to. I think he paid off at his ADP in 12-team redraft leagues. And this is a guy that could be going in the first round as soon as next year. But we also had A.J. Dillon on that list. Tony Pollard, I know he's hurt, but he looks like he could be a smash over the next couple of weeks. We'll talk about the Cowboys and the whole NFC East just like everyone else in the world does. Here in a moment, we get into some of these schedules, who has the better matchups. But one of the questions in the Discord, one of the things that you and I need to talk about is the roster mindset. Now, you and I are both in playoffs in our leagues. Not all of them, unfortunately. And things are rough out here with COVID and with injuries and guys who are playing a little bit banged up. Look at Deebo Samuel, Ezekiel Elliott, guys that are just kind of getting tapered down but are typically these stud producers. How does the mindset change when you're looking at waivers, when you're stacking up your lineup, looking weeks in advance? Like, what is the approach in our minds? What should we be thinking over these next 3 weeks? Because it's definitely different than week 1.
Yeah, to me, it all comes down to ensuring your roster with upside. Like, I don't want a running back that might get me 10 PP. I don't want a Nyheim Hines on my team right now. Like, that's a perfect example. I would rather have, if Nyheim Hines is a guy on my bench, if he's my 4th, my 5th running back, I don't need him down the stretch because I don't necessarily think he's going to win me a league. Now, obviously, every single circumstance is different. Every league is different. And we've seen Hines pop off in the past. But right now, one, I want to be ensuring my key assets, especially at the running back position, where time and time again, it's kind of a next man up mentality. For example, I have Nick Chubb on one of my favorite playoff rosters. I'm going to be doing everything I can to get Dearness Johnson. Unfortunately, I was out of fab in a league, and I was not able to scoop him up on waivers. But that's a guy I would rather have than a Nyheim Hines in that situation. Because if Nick Chubb was to go down, I have Dearness Johnson to fill right in. And if Nick Chubb stays active, like, there's no reason for me to have these depth pieces on my bench. So to me, ensuring your own assets can be very, very important. And then also just stashing that upside. You have guys on our show sheet, stuff like Samaje Perine, Khalil Herbert. Like, these are perfect names and guys that are probably on your waiver wire, where there is a world where if Joe Mixon were to miss a game, if David Montgomery were to miss a game, these guys would be in contention to be in your lineup. So that's what you have to think about. Right now, I want upside, and I also want insurance for the guys that I have, if it makes sense. Now, one more thing I'll add. I have Najee Harris on a playoff team. I'm not necessarily looking to add Kalen Ballage or Benny Snell, because honestly, to me, if Najee Harris was to miss time, I still don't feel like I'm going to be comfortable starting either of those guys. So you have to look at the right situations where there is a clear next man up that's going to take that workload. Otherwise, you're probably fine to just stick with what you've got and take a gamble on a handcuff that's on another team.
Great point. And especially in some of these deeper leagues, having those handcuffs with a clear path to all the volume is exactly what you're looking for. And not only can that insulate you against one of your guys getting hurt, like if you have a Joe Mixon, and if he happens to go down next week, at least you have the next man up that you can plug right in, but also grabbing other running backs. And that's who you should be filling up on your bench right now. Get those upside plays to where if you see that Saquon Barkley, if something happens again with Saquon, you have Devontae Booker. He's seeing some nice matchup over the next 3 weeks. He could even be a flex name for you, not to mention if you're waiting on a Deandre Swift who may or may not come back. If you're waiting for Ezekiel Elliott to get fully healthy again, maybe something happens with him and he suffers a setback. You just never know what's going to happen. And so lean into some of that volatility. Get the guys with clear paths to touches. And you mentioned some of them here. I'll go through a quick list I put together. Devontae Booker, Samaje Perine, Khalil Herbert, D'Ernest Johnson. Justin Jackson is an interesting one to me as a guy who could be the primary pass catcher in LA if Austin Eckler were to go down. He did practice on Wednesday, but was questionable coming out of the game last Sunday. They have that Thursday game this week, so quick turnaround for Eckler. Keep an eye on that. And then even in weird situations like Duke Johnson or Garrett Oakes, if you're scraping the bottom of the barrel in like a 14-team league, all the Miami running backs.
Deep leagues.
All the Miami running backs, bro. Myles Gaskin, Phillip Lindsay.
Yeah, one more. Ronald Jones is another one, Steph. Ronald Jones is one that we can't forget about. If Leonard Fournette was to miss time, I think he would be that next man up.
I think he'd be in a split with Gio, but I think we've gotten our point across. Like, you got to fill up with these guys because that running back position is so fragile. Another thing that you should be doing in this playoff stretch is looking a week or two in advance. You know, we are past that point where, I just need to make the playoffs. I just need to focus on the next week. You're looking 2-3 weeks out to go and win these championships. So if you're streaming defenses, look in the weeks ahead. Get your stud defenses. Even if right now they're just going to sit on your bench and not do anything for your lineup, that's completely fine. It's okay to use your bench and just focus on the next 3 weeks. You're not looking for these guys that might pop down the stretch like Rashad Bateman earlier in the year. You're not waiting for a Bryan Edwards to finally break out. We don't have time for that. You need guys that are going to produce for you now. And so a defense, as ugly as this is, as gross as the defensive position is for fantasy in our redraft leagues, they don't put up that many points. Look ahead for teams that are playing the Jets, playing the Texans.
Yes.
Go ahead and stack up on those names. That way you're not scraping the bottom of the barrel on the waiver wire in a panic for those weeks and maybe even get stuck with a bad start. And same thing with quarterbacks. And I think we need to talk about, a few of the QBs, and there's some stud quarterbacks right now that are questionable. We have Josh Allen showing up questionable. We don't know if he's going to play this week. We have Lamar Jackson, who's banged up, probably going to play, but who knows if he'll be 100%. The rushing might get capped with his ankle issue. Aaron Rodgers has been questionable for like the last month and a half with his toe problem. So if you have any of these guys, you need to grab some streamers. Go ahead and stack up on these guys, even if you don't think you'll need them now. Like if you plan on starting Aaron Rodgers this week, that's great, but who knows if they could suffer a setback. Now, I'm not telling you to go get Mitch Trubisky or Jordan Love or Tyler Huntley. Don't get these backup quarterbacks, but there's a few names out there right now that I am targeting that probably made it past waivers in a lot of leagues. The first one, Alex, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, it's Taysom Hill. Mm-hmm. Over the next 3 weeks, he has a road game against Tampa Bay. They're 27th against the quarterback position. Miami, they're 12th against the quarterback position. And Carolina, who unfortunately they are 5th, but I don't really care that much for Taysom Hill's purposes. In games as a starter since last year, he's averaging 21.5 fantasy points per game, typically getting you 2+ all-purpose touchdowns. He has done that in all but 2 of those games where he has been the starter for New Orleans. So I love Taysom Hill as a streamer to get you down the stretch if he is available.
Yeah, I love that pick. I feel pretty comfortable starting Taysom Hill, and even if you do have one of these starters, whether you have Josh Allen, Lamar, Aaron Rodgers, the guys you mentioned dealing with injuries, or if you don't, I still think if there is a premium streamer on the waiver wire that has a rushing upside, especially like Taysom Hill, you should pick him up, honestly, just because of what we're seeing right now with COVID in the NFL. We are seeing a spike in these cases. We just have to address the elephant in the room and what's going on. We are going to continue to see players go on the COVID list. Happened to Baker Mayfield this week. He is now questionable at the time of this recording to play on Saturday because he is on the COVID list. And you never know. Like, I've been rocking with Matt Stafford for the majority of the year in our home league, Stef, but I went ahead and I picked up Justin Fields off the waiver wire just because if for some reason on game day or the day before the game, Matt Stafford was to miss for some reason, I have to have some sort of backup option there. So Justin Fields is another one with rushing upside. I would much prefer Taysom Hill. I would much prefer Tua, who you have on your list as well. But Justin Fields is another one where, like, I feel a lot better about his potential upside with his legs, things like that, than some desperation streamer off the waiver wire. So we just have to say, like, this is also the time of year where you should maybe pick up a backup quarterback that has some upside, even if they are a little bit more volatile. And to your point, back to Taysom Hill, I think he would be the premier option for this exact circumstance. He has Alvin Kamara back. That's going to help them move the ball down the field. He can do enough in the passing game to maybe give you a couple of extra points here and there. But the main event with Taysom Hill is the legs. We saw that come out last week, had the garbage time rushing touchdown. But he is a goal line threat, an absolute touchdown threat every single week. And he can get to space as well. I mean, you see the Saints in these third and shorts, fourth and shorts. They have 8 offensive linemen on the field, a fullback in the backfield, and Taysom Hill just runs it right up the middle. So I love Taysom Hill as a premium streamer. If you need a backup QB just to ensure yourself through the fantasy playoffs, he's perfect. And if you have to start him, I really like the call.
Now, the antithesis to Taysom Hill is Jimmy Garoppolo. Jimmy G has 3 great matchups to end the year. All of the 49ers do, honestly. I love all the 49ers down the stretch here. Their next 3 games, Atlanta, Tennessee, and Houston. And Jimmy Garoppolo is playing really well right now. He's super accurate. He has George Kittle finally healthy. Finally, Kittle is back to his dominant self. Brandon Ayuk is healthy. Deebo Samuel, we don't know. He's probably going to play, but maybe more of a decoy. They'll give him a few carries. Still a guy that I think you have to start, but should regardless help Jimmy G in these easy matchups. And if you look at Garoppolo, he's 3rd in yards per attempt right now, 5th in completion rate under pressure. And with all these weapons, he's number 1 in the NFL in receiver yards after the catch per pass attempt. So you add in the accuracy, the playmakers, that's going to equate to fantasy points. Somewhere between that 15 to 25 range is what I'm projecting for Jimmy G on a weekly basis, which makes him a startable asset if you're streaming the quarterback position and don't have one of these top 6 names. You mentioned Tua as another one. He gets Devontae Parker back. We have the running backs, Gaskin, Salvon Ahmed, Phillip Lindsay, all on the COVID list. And they have a pretty easy matchup as well. They have the Jets here in Week 15. And they play New Orleans, who's 21st against the quarterback position. And then Tennessee in the Fantasy Football Championships. They're 26th against the quarterback position. They're terrible at defending the pass. So love those next 3 matchups for Tua. And guess what? This blew my mind. Tua Tagovailoa is averaging 21.3 fantasy points per game in his 7 complete games this season. He is producing, even with limited weapons, with just Jalen Waddle and Mike Gesicki and Darren Smythe and all these, like, Mac Hollins, and like, they're just piecing it together in Miami. But you add in the easy matchups and the way Tua is playing, you got to love him. I think we are seeing Tua learn how to be a little bit more of a game manager and not take quite as many risks, which I think will insulate his box scores down the stretch. I don't know what that's going to mean for fantasy because interceptions are whatever, but at least for him staying in the lineup, not getting benched for Jacoby Brissett, makes me feel a lot better about Tua from a stability standpoint.
Steph, the Dolphins, I've been tracking the Dolphins for a while now because they just started so poorly. I've been to 3 NFL games live this season in 3 different stadiums, and it just happened to work out to where the Dolphins were playing in each and every one. So I've had an up close and personal look at Miami this season. I've just been kind of like tracking their season. They start out 1-7, absolutely brutal. Tua's out. They've won 5 games in a row. They're 6-7. They played the Jets this week in a very winnable game. Saints next week is winnable. They finished with the Titans and the Patriots, so some tough games there. But Steph, they're one game out of the playoffs in the AFC. If the Dolphins can get hot here, they legitimately could sneak back into the playoffs on this incredible winning streak. So I'm with you. Tua has been phenomenal. Ever since he came back from that injury, came in the Baltimore game when Jacoby Brissett went down and led them back in that game for the win. And he has not looked back. He's been fantastic. Jalen Waddle's been fantastic. Devontae Parker gives him a lift, as you said. So Tua, from a fantasy perspective, with the fantasy football schedule they have coming up, I think is phenomenal. So Steph, before we do move on, we've talked about a lot of different QBs here. We've talked about Taysom Hill, Jimmy Garoppolo, Tua. I've even mentioned Justin Fields. If you had to rank those four in order of which ones you would want to have as a streamer down the stretch, how would you rank those guys?
I would go exactly in that order. Put Taysom at the top, Jimmy G and Tua right below him. And I'll throw out one more. And this is a really gross one. This is another one for deep leagues. Alex, you and I are passionate about the deep leagues.
Oh, yeah.
We see, people have questions that they're 8 and 10 team leagues. There's so much depth there that you don't have to play these games. And there's a lot less, to be honest, just skill required as a fantasy player to know these rosters, know the depth pieces.
There's one guy that's so deep I was scared to bring up. And if it's the same guy, then I'm going to be absolutely floored. But there's one guy I got my eye on. I'm interested to see if
my guy is Big Ben. And I know it's gross. I know he's declining, but these are the last 4 regular season games of Ben Roethlisberger's career. Maybe the last 4 games he ever plays. And he has pretty good matchups, 2 of which I think are going to turn into shootouts. He has Tennessee at home this week. They're 26th against the quarterback. At Kansas City, they're 24th against the position. Anytime as Mahomes is on the other side of the ball, that could be a shootout. And then as a Browns fan, this game terrifies me. The Browns take on the Steelers in Pittsburgh. I think the Steelers are going to be wanting to get their revenge. I think Big Ben is going to want his revenge after that embarrassment in the playoffs last year that the Browns gave the Steelers. So I think if you look at Big Ben's last couple weeks, it's not pretty. And the way it's going to get done is not going to be flashy. But 3 of the last 4 weeks, he's had 19 or more fantasy points, throwing multiple touchdowns. Of course, he's never going to do anything with his legs, but the volume has been there. They've been in these shootout game scripts, and he has the weapons to get it done. So I love the matchups for Big Ben, and so that's why he is a guy that in deep leagues and desperation situations, you can plug Big Ben in there to get you 18 to 22.
See, that's not the guy I was thinking of because I cannot endorse Big Ben this season. I am super invested in Najee, and because he has made my eyes bleed with the Steelers offense so many times, I just cannot put him into my lineup. The name I was thinking of is so much deeper than Big Ben that I'm just going to keep it to myself this time. So we will save the people from that one. But I
just
do
say the
know
name.
that you
just say the name. You don't have to give a take. Just say the name.
Well, I have to give some context behind it. If you were a Jalen Hurts manager, you might know where I'm going now. He might miss this week, and if he does, I think you can fire up Gardner Minshew against the Washington football team. This is a 1-week thing. This is not for the rest of the playoffs because when Hurts is back, he's going to be in. But we saw Gardner Minshew come in against the Jets. He played really well, 20 for 25.
So efficient.
242 yards, 2 touchdowns, had 11 rushing yards as well. Gets Washington this week, who is 32nd against the quarterback position, giving up 21 fantasy points per game. So if Hurts is out, I think Minshew is viable. And if anything, he is a prime DFS play this week on Sunday.
I love it, man. I love it. That's perfect. Now let's talk.
I've been a big Gardner Minshew believer for a very long time, so I had to throw that in there.
And it makes no sense how he is not a starter right now. If you look around at some of the quarterbacks that teams are rolling out there, how did no one go get Gardner Minshew this offseason?
I mean,
the Eagles were the only ones smart enough to do it.
We've talked offline, Steph, about how many quarterback-needy teams there are going to be going into next year. And there are reports already that there are teams interested in Gardner Minshew in a trade in the offseason. So I do think Gardner Minshew will end up starting somewhere in the NFL in 2022. Just remains to be seen where. But he's someone who, in his first season as a rookie, had better numbers than Trevor Lawrence did in Jacksonville through this point in his career. So I know there's a lot of other factors in play, but if you stack up Minshew's numbers against other guys in that draft class, even guys like Kyler Murray, he's not as far off as you might think, and he's done it with considerably less, considering he played in Jacksonville for several seasons. So enough on Minshew. Only start him if you are absolutely reckless, but a good DFS play as well, if he's the starter this week.
Great call there. And like you said, with COVID, that could come back.
Who knows?
That could come back.
Yep.
Well, let's talk about some of the guys that are returning from injury, because right now we're getting a lot of guys that are coming back, whether that's Chase Edmonds, Deandre Swift, TJ Hawkinson, maybe
Henderson.
We have, great call, Henderson, and even guys that recently got hurt. Kareem Hunt going in for an MRI, probably going to miss the rest of the year. Already talked about Deebo Samuel. So let's get into some of these teams, some of these situations, give our takes about how you should be thinking about these guys now that things are changing as we go into playoff time. Let's start with the Lions. It's a little nerve-wracking. And honestly, I am a Swift owner in a couple leagues, and I'm nervous. I think they could easily shut him down. He still hasn't practiced. We're recording right now on Wednesday. And same thing for TJ Hawkinson. And these are two of the premium assets, the guys that have carried the load for the Detroit Lions almost all year long. And I don't know whether it's truly just the injury is that brutal, or maybe Detroit trying to say, hey, these are our top guys. Let's not rush them back early. We're in a rebuild clearly right now. We're going to load up in the draft, maybe or maybe not get a quarterback. We will see. I think it may be a longer-term rebuild than Lions fans probably want. But do you think Swift and Hawkinson come back? And if they do, how willing are you to put them in lineups? Because they have Arizona, Atlanta, and Seattle over the next 3 weeks.
It's tough. If I was the coach, if I was the GM, and I have TJ Hawkinson and DeAndre Swift, and I'm at all worried about an injury, I'm just shutting them down for the season. So that's where the concern comes in with the Lions. They got the win under their belt. They don't have anything to play for. Honestly, if anything, they should be trying to lose games. I know that's not how the NFL works, and it shouldn't be, but I don't see the upside in them rushing Swift back or rushing Hawkinson back. Now, I do know Dan Campbell, as their head coach, is super hardcore, wants to win every single game. It's hard not to just root for that guy. So I know when the time comes, like Hawkinson and Swift, hopefully will be back in the lineup. I just don't think it's going to be this week. DeAndre Swift, him being back this week would have been quick from the timeline we saw when he went out. And TJ Hawkinson, I've been following him closely because I am invested in Hawkinson in several places, and it's a hand injury. And last week he started out with limited practice, eventually was downgraded to out to finish the week, and then to start out this week, he's not in practice. So if TJ Hawkinson has a hand injury, has a heavy wrap, things like that, I almost wonder with this Lions team, if he's active, how much are they even going to utilize him? I know he's one of the only pass catchers they have, honestly the best pass catcher they have on the roster. Arguably DeAndre Swift would be the other one. But maybe they use him a lot as a blocker. If his receiving ability is at all compromised by a hand wrap, maybe a hard cast, something like that, depending on how severe the hand injury is, I just wonder how much he's really going to be route running. I wonder how much he's going to be separated from the line, things like that. And to add insult to injury, they're playing the Arizona Cardinals, who are second in the NFL against the tight end position. So honestly, I'm very worried about Hawkinson this week, even if he's active. If he's active in most leagues, you're probably going to have to play him. But Steph, I've got a tough decision in a league where I have Tyler Higbee against Seattle, who's 30th against the tight end, or TJ Hawkinson. And honestly, I think I'm going to roll with Tyler Higbee regardless, just because I'm that concerned about Hawkinson's usage this week. And with DeAndre Swift, he's someone to me, if he's active, you play him. No questions asked, no hesitations at all.
Past this Week 15 matchup against Arizona, Atlanta and Seattle are prime matchups for all the Detroit weapons, if you're streaming them. Obviously, Swift and Hawkinson are the only premium guys that you want to put out there. But you look at Amon-Ra St. Brown, 2 weeks back-to-back with 12 targets. Yeah. You and I liked him a lot throughout the draft process. He was a late second-round dynasty pick in rookie drafts for us. He was a guy that I really liked just because he had a clear path to volume in year one. So he was kind of a draft and flip type guy. But he is doing what we thought he was able to do coming into the league. And with Atlanta, they're bottom 7 against the quarterback, running back, and wide receiver position and fantasy football. And then almost the same thing with Seattle. They're 31st against the run, 8th against the wide receiver, okay, but then 28th against the tight end position. So if any of these guys play, you have to start them. Amon-Ra St. Brown becomes a premium streaming option as a 1 week rental. Definitely not a guy that I'm holding to see if he pops off. But if I got to plug somebody in last minute, he's the pick for me. Let's talk about the Cleveland Browns. We have Kareem Hunt hurt, probably done for the year. And on top of that, we have a COVID outbreak in Cleveland. We have Baker Mayfield on the COVID list, Jarvis Landry on the COVID list, Austin Hooper on the COVID list. It really comes down to Nick Chubb, Donovan Peoples-Jones, and Case Keenum. Over these next 3 weeks, we have a Saturday game coming up in a few days against the Raiders. And then after that, it's on the road against Green Bay and Pittsburgh. The only guy you really feel good about rolling out there is Nick Chubb, who has seen a bump. Right now sitting at 13th in fantasy points per game, 3 targets per game since Kareem Hunt's been hurt, up from just 1 a game when Hunt was active. Then he's had 4 targets over the last 2 games. And you add in the fact that these are great running matchups. I love Nick Chubb down the stretch, but I'm also a little bit worried at the same time because it's like, how is this offense going to produce if they have literally no one else who can matriculate the ball downfield? They also have 2 offensive linemen on the COVID list.
Yeah, it's certainly nerve-wracking stuff. And the thing that you said it there at the end, the offensive lineman on the COVID list is really what scares me because we've seen this before. We saw the Browns early in the season against Denver. It was, I believe it was a Thursday night matchup, and they were depleted. I mean, Baker was out, Nick Chubb was out, Kareem Hunt was out. They were totally depleted on the offensive side of the ball. And fortunately for them, Case Keenum is one of the better backups in the NFL, so he can do enough to manage the game as long as the running game is working. And in that game, Cleveland against, at the time, a pretty good Denver Broncos run defense had Dearness Johnson go for 22 carries, 146 yards, and a touchdown. Obviously, they had offensive linemen that were healthier than they would be if they had the 2 miss on Saturday, but I do believe they were a little bit banged up on the offensive line in that game as well. So I think Nick Chubb can get it done. I'm definitely concerned about the offense's production as a whole, but Las Vegas is a pretty good matchup. You know, they're not great against the run. They're not great against the pass. I think Cleveland should be able to establish the run against Vegas, and they're going to need to. And for the Cleveland offense, I think if David Njoku can get out there, I think if Harrison Bryant at the tight end position can get back on the field this week, obviously you said Donovan Peoples-Jones at this point will be out there. Those will be huge lifts to the offense. They just need any reliable, familiar pieces as possible. And I think you can start Nick Chubb. And yeah, I think that's probably it on the offensive side of the ball. I'm not going to get cute. Maybe DPJ if you're in a huge pinch in case Keenum is the quarterback. I think you roll him out there in a deep league. But to me, it's kind of Nick Chubb, and that's all I'm interested in at this point. It's interesting to scoop up Dearness Johnson for sure, just in case something happens. I know Chubb was on the COVID list just a couple weeks ago. Not a medical expert, so who knows? He could go back on there. I don't really know. There's a lot of conflicting viewpoints on that in and of itself. But I think Dearness, regardless of this week, is a good handcuff to pick up down the stretch, but not someone you're starting just yet, even with Kareem Hunt inactive.
Well, let's talk about the NFC East, the most overhyped division in the sport. But it's interesting because over these next 3 weeks, all of these teams just play each other. It's like a carousel NFC East matchups all the way across the board. We have Philadelphia and Washington that only play NFC East teams. So Philly plays the Washington football team, then the Giants, then back to Washington again. And then in Washington, obviously they play Philly twice with a Dallas matchup sandwiched in there. Then you look at Dallas, they have the Giants, Washington football team, and then the Arizona Cardinals should be a juicy one in week 17 in the Fantasy Football Championships. And the Giants, they play Dallas, Philly, and then Chicago to end the fantasy football portion of the season. You know, to me, I love these NFC East matchups, and there's really only a few defensive matchups that really scare me for any of these skill position players, and it's the Cowboys defense, who's been great at shutting down the running back position. They've been just solid as an overall defensive unit. They're allowing the 8th fewest fantasy points to the quarterback position. So you get a little bit nervous about quarterbacks and running backs if you're streaming guys or looking at flex type names when they play the Cowboys. The Washington football team, they've been absolutely brutal against any pass catching weapons. They're 12th against the running back. Still really doesn't concern me. I'm probably firing them up, especially now that they've lost Chase Young. And then the Eagles. And the only unit that scares you on the Eagles is their secondary. They're 3rd against the wide receiver position in terms of fantasy points per game. They are stopping with Darius Slay now, past the concussion protocol. The Eagles are able to stop the pass, but not the run, and certainly not the tight end. They're dead last against the tight end position. So there's a lot of great matchups you can be playing. You're firing up your Dallas Cowboys. We don't need to go through every single roster, but I think if you have Zeke, you're going to have to play him. I think they are tempering his usage a little bit. I think he's not 100%, but I think you still have to play him because of the touchdown upside, especially in these really good matchups that they have. Same thing with Tony Pollard. We've seen him step up and take on a larger snap share, get more usage. Now, he had the foot injury missed last week, but he's supposed to come back, be healthy. These are going to be guys to keep an eye on and probably going to be in your lineups if you've made it this far into the fantasy season. I don't think much changes with the Giants. You're hoping Saquon can get back to form, but not expecting it. Unfortunately, Kadarius Toney's out. We really liked him, but you're not starting Galladay. I've heard some people have questions about Sterling Shepard. I don't mind him as a low-end wide receiver 3 flex type option if you don't have any other exciting options, which we'll talk about here as we continue down this show sheet. And then for Washington, man, I really like, now with Terry McLaurin out, I think Cam Sims and DeAndre Carter become deep flex names.
Yeah, this is such a weird scheduling glitch that happened this season with so many matchups in the division at the same time. And to your point, I think the matchups are good. I don't know about necessarily great, though. You look at this division, it's not really what we thought it was going to be coming into the season. The Cowboys' defense has been much more impressive than we expected. And you look over at Washington football team, their defense has been much worse than we expected. And the shootouts that we were hoping for the high-powered Cowboys offense. We were hoping for Daniel Jones with all the receivers and Saquon back to put up points. We were hoping for Ryan Fitzpatrick to ball out with Washington. We were hoping for Jalen Hurts to do more than rush for 150 yards a game and to be able to put up more pass volume than he has. So because some of the offenses have struggled, I think that has tended to lead to less and less shootouts, lower scoring games. You see Washington in these grinded out type of games. But something that is interesting for this division down the stretch is that all these teams are still alive. The Cowboys are the clear favorites right now to win the division, but Washington and Philly are still fighting for a wild card spot. And I just looked at this stuff. The Giants are still very much alive. If they win out because of how the schedule shakes out, if they win their last 4 games, one, I'm not saying that's likely, probably near impossible. But if they do, and they just get a tiny bit of help from other games around the league, they would actually be a wild card team. So all 4 of these teams are still alive. They all have good matchups. I wouldn't necessarily call them all great matchups, but a division to watch. And there's a ton of fantasy football assets available here. You talk about the Cowboys. I think most of those guys are starts. You got to start Zeke, even though he's hurt you. Amari Cooper, CeeDee Lamb are in your lineup. Gallup is an interesting flex. The Giants, whoever's healthy, at least warrants consideration. Washington, I think, is probably the team that's the most disappointing and the least predictable right now. Even Terry McLaurin and Antonio Gibson have had their ups and downs. And then for the Eagles, it's pretty streamlined. You're starting Hurts if he's out there, and you're starting Devonta Smith, probably Dallas Goedert, and it gets sketchy beyond that. So there's a lot of tough calls with each of these teams, but those are the kind of calls that are going to make or break your season, and that's why we have that Discord channel to answer those questions for you on the fly.
Now let's pivot back to the AFC North and talk about the Ravens. They have Green Bay, Cincinnati, and the Rams as their fantasy football playoff matchups, and Lamar Jackson is hurt. He didn't practice Wednesday as of this recording. He might get in some limited sessions Thursday and Friday, but it sounds like the plan is for Lamar to be active and out there in the game. But whether it's Lamar or Tyler Huntley, I'm still willing to start the same Ravens weapons that I've had confidence in. If you look at what Tyler Huntley just did against a very strong Browns defense with a bunch of stud defensive playmakers, Huntley was impressive. A 71 completion rate, 270 yards, and a touchdown through the air, 6 for 45 rushing. But we're seeing the way that Huntley plays much more conservative than Lamar Jackson. And it may just been something that happened because of the lack of tape or a game plan shift, but we saw Huntley have a field day playing that more conservative type of quarterback role compared to Lamar Jackson. We had Rashad Bateman having a pretty big game, his first 100-yard game, caught 7 of 8 for 103 yards. Hollywood Brown was also targeted 8 times in that game, but only for 5 for 41. And so Bateman, to me, is a guy that you should have on your roster, maybe even in lineups down the stretch here in the fantasy football playoffs, because the pendulum is starting to swing the other way from Hollywood Brown at this point.
Yeah, Steph, I don't know, man. I have a hard time with this one. We saw Tyler Huntley earlier in the season against the Chicago Bears, and it was an absolute nasty slugfest. I think it was like 9-6 in that game. Maybe let me spot check that one, but there were not a lot of points scored, and I just have a hard time believing. I know Lamar Jackson has been disappointing lately, But I just have a really hard time believing that Tyler Huntley is going to come in and do more for this offense than Lamar Jackson. Maybe in the way he plays, he does spread the ball out more, plays a little bit more conservatively. But I have to believe that there are just going to be less points scored. Okay, that Bears game was 16-13. Both teams got a touchdown late. But I just feel like the volume is capped with Tyler Huntley out there. It makes me really concerned. We don't have a huge sample size on this guy. So to me, that translates to, I think Mark Andrews is safe. He's a must start. But if I can fade Rashad
What
Bateman,
a game from Andrews, dude. 11 for 11 for 115 and a touchdown.
he was phenomenal. He's but
so
I'm
safe.
actually trying to avoid Bateman or Hollywood if I can this week, if Tyler Huntley is starting, just because, I mean, that could be an absolute landmine, in my opinion. Now, every league is different. Every situation is different. If there are not great other options, sure, you can play Hollywood. You can play Bateman as flex options. And we'll get into some names later. Maybe we'll have to compare them and tie them back to Bateman and Hollywood Brown. But there's just a lot of names out there, like Christian Kirk, AJ Green with Hopkins out are two prime examples. I'd play either of those guys over Bateman. Definitely over Bateman this week and probably over Hollywood as well.
Huntley had the good week, but you're right. It's definitely a massive downgrade for the offense overall as a whole. But really good to see for Devonta Freeman. Shout out to Devonta Freeman coming back. And since week 9, he's been the RB10 in overall fantasy football points scored at the running back position. He's been very good for fantasy. 4.5 targets per game over the last 6 weeks. 5 for 5 receiving last week with Tyler Huntley. So this is the guy that if you scooped him off the waiver wire, you found a diamond in the rough. Maybe you even traded for him. He's a guy that if you're just plugging him into your RB2 spot every week, I think you can do that regardless of who that quarterback starter is. And I think Huntley will actually lead to more check down volume, at least from a limited sample size. We did see that he was willing to do that. Granted, so has Lamar Jackson. And with him not being able to run with that ankle injury, might also see some insulation in the passing game for Devonta Freeman. But let's go into another division, the NFC West. A lot of great matchups for all of these teams. We've talked about some of them already, but let's just go through each one of these teams and break down the fantasy situation over the next 3 weeks. We already talked about San Francisco. They're against Atlanta, who's bottom 7 against the quarterback, running back, and wide receiver. Then they play against Tennessee and then Houston. You're starting all your guys here. Elijah Mitchell could be a league winner, that league saver for a lot of people if he plays. Seems like the 49ers are happy to run back guys into their lineups that aren't necessarily 100%. We saw that with Debo last week. I think you still have to start Debo just because of how good these matchups are and because he's just that good, has been this season, a top 10 wide receiver. I think you have to plug him in there, but you're 100% starting Kittle. And as long as Debo's banged up, I'm totally okay with, especially in these good matchups, to roll out Brandon Ayuk. I know he saved you with the game-winning touchdown in overtime against Cincinnati last week, but he's been putting up some numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. Brandon Ayuk has become not a must-start, but a premier, flex kind of option. I'll tie it back to the guys we just talked about, Rashad Bateman, Hollywood Brown. As crazy as it sounds, I didn't think we'd get here this season, but I would rather start Brandon Ayuk than Rashad Bateman or Hollywood Brown this week and probably for the rest of the season.
Over the last 7 weeks for Brandon Ayuk, that's a decent sample size, man. 7 targets per game for Ayuk. So now not only is he getting the snaps, he's getting the targets, coming off that 11-target game. And we know he's a touchdown scorer. We know he is a freak athlete who can make plays with the ball in his hands. Hasn't played less than 90% of snaps since week 8. So love the ascension for Brandon Ayuk, and I think he is a weekly flex consideration type of name. But let's talk about the Rams. They have Seattle, Minnesota, and Baltimore. Seattle, 31st against the run, makes, whether it's Sony Michel or Darrell Henderson, they're smash plays this week. And even in a desperation situation, I might still be willing to roll out Sony Michel as an RB2, even with Henderson back and healthy, because I don't think he's going to be 100%.
Yeah, I agree. Henderson is a tough one, man. And I know you and I were really big on him, especially midseason. He was climbing up our rankings, moved into our top 12, and he followed up on that for the next couple weeks. But the injuries and the availability has just crushed Darrell Henderson. And while he's been out, we have seen Sony Michel play very, very well. So I'm with you. I think Sony has earned himself a role, and we've seen this in the past from Sean McVay. I mean, there was even the season where Todd Gurley was kind of starting to fall off that edge, And we saw other guys like CJ Anderson come in and have 100+ yard games. So like Sean McVay is going to ride the hot hand, I believe. I don't think this is a David Montgomery, Khalil Herbert situation where it's like, hey, you played great, but this guy's the starter. I think they are going to try to manage Darrell Henderson just because of the injury history. So I think both guys are playable. Now, Darrell Henderson, obviously the expectations come down a little bit if he's not as much of a bell cow as he was before, but he still is someone I'm willing to start. And I do think Sony Michel does move into that RB2 consideration as well. So probably limits and caps the upside for either guy, but it does mean that both have some sort of fantasy football value as we head down the stretch. If you're one of those owners that has Darrell Henderson and you had Sony Michel as the handcuff, this is probably worst case scenario for you, but that's just the way it's going to be. So I would prefer Henderson over Michel if both are active and you're making that decision, but you just have to temper expectation with these two guys.
And obviously if one misses, fire up the other one. We'll see if Henderson gets back. He is technically on the COVID list right now, so that could keep him sidelined for one more week. But I love this 3-game stretch for the Rams coming up because it's teams with bad defenses and or shootout game scripts. Seattle, you got Russell Wilson on their side of the ball. I know things have been declining for the Seahawks, but still they are capable of a potential shootout, and you're definitely going to start whoever's active and doesn't have COVID, whether it's Cooper Kupp, Odell Beckham. You already talked about Tyler Higbee as a streaming tight end, especially for this week against Seattle, is a smash stream spot. You look at Minnesota, they've been in shootouts literally all season long. They've actually been one of the most fun teams to watch, in my opinion. A lot of people were like, oh, Steelers versus Vikings, what a boring game. I hate this Thursday. I'm like, that actually sounds pretty fun to me because Kirk Cousins is creating these shootouts. The Vikings defense can't stop anybody, and there's weapons, whether it's Justin Jefferson, Dalvin Cook, even KJ Osborne is making some big plays. So I like the shootout game at Minnesota for the Rams in Week 16. And then Baltimore, any game against Baltimore could be a high-scoring affair, even though the defense is a little bit tougher. But you already know who you're starting. We've already gone through all the players. And then Stafford, obviously, every single week, must start, assuming health and the weaponry is there. Now let's talk about Arizona. I think they're the one with the most to break down here. But I love their schedule over the next 3 weeks as well. This whole NFC West, it's silly how good all of their matchups happen to be. They have Detroit, Indianapolis, and Dallas as their fantasy football championship matchups. Kyler's back. He's healthy. The rushing production has been there. He's averaging 60 rushing yards per game since he's returned. He's had multiple rushing touchdowns, and he's still giving you some pass volume on top of that. So everything is there with Kyler. I see him as all systems go, back 100% from that injury. But unfortunately, the same thing cannot be said for DeAndre Hopkins. Probably going to be out the rest of the season.
Yeah, that's a bummer.
Again, we're recording this on Wednesday the 15th. Does not sound positive. I think they're getting a second opinion before officially shutting him down. But this gets me actually really excited for some of the other pass catchers, primarily A.J. Green and Christian Kirk as flex names down the stretch. Alex, I'm curious how you see this passing game breaking down in Arizona, especially with Chase Edmonds supposedly returning next week.
Yeah, it's interesting, and we're going to have to see what happens this first game with Hopkins out. But yeah, I think Christian Kirk and A.J. Green get big bumps. I think Rondale Moore gets a small bump as well. But I still think his two boom bust.
Not enough volume
to put in there in a redraft league, especially in the playoffs. But Christian Kirk and A.J. Green were guys that were flex type names anyway. So now you remove the DeAndre Hopkins targets from this offense, the touchdown upside from this offense, and there's just a lot more to go around for Kirk and A.J. Green. So both guys get a bump. I expect each guy to get an extra target or two per game because of Hopkins being out. I also think Zach Ertz gets a little bit more interesting at the tight end position. But yeah, I think Christian Kirk and A.J. Green, if they're on your waiver wire, by all means pick them up. Both Christian Kirk especially. I mean, he's had some big games this season and has been more consistent than you probably think if you go look at his game log. So Christian Kirk, to me, is someone I feel fairly comfortable starting, especially in some of these good matchups. I think he is going to be that guy that's the wide receiver one. He's going to have that big play potential, where A.J. Green is probably going to be more of a threat in the red zone. So both are going to play their different roles. But both certainly do have a lot of merit as flex wide receiver 2 options down the stretch, especially in deeper leagues.
I was interested to see if you were going to say A.J. Green versus Christian Kirk. Glad to hear that we're in agreement that Kirk is the play. And it feels a little bit weird to say that because if you actually compare their season-long stats and their advanced analytics, they're actually almost dead even, but you just like Christian Kirk for his utilization and the uses that he's getting. He's been moved into the slot. He plays about half of his snaps there, meaning that he's starting his route with some separation. He is operating as more of a big play field stretcher type guy, but he's not necessarily like a one-trick pony like a Darius Slayton or a Donovan Peoples-Jones. Both Kirk and A.J. Green are tied with 5.5 targets per game. A.J. Green actually has more red zone targets, a longer target distance, better yards per catch, and 60 more air yards, and he plays the X without DeAndre Hopkins. Saw 10 targets last week against the Rams to Christian Kirk's 6. So I think that actually makes A.J. Green a decent option as well. I definitely prefer Kirk because I think he does have that higher upside just because we've seen that recently. It's almost like, what have you done for me lately? And I want Christian Kirk's boom potential, that 2 or 3 touchdown game that he has in the tank, especially in these games against Detroit and Dallas. Whereas A.J. Green can be more of that consistent floor play. It's really more of a touchdown or bust, but I think he does get a floor of 8 to 10 points with that touchdown taking him over the top into that double-digit range. Now, is James Conner still a weekly start when Edmonds returns? Because for a lot of fantasy managers, their ascension into the fantasy football playoffs has been built around this James Conner takeover that's been happening in Arizona. What happens when Edmonds comes back?
Yeah, I think he absolutely is. And I mean, obviously we saw the big game from Conner through the air last week, but Conner's been phenomenal all season. He's been a touchdown threat all season. So I think even with Edmonds back and Conner being a little banged up, we have to mention at the time of this recording, he was getting some testing done on that. I believe it was an ankle at the end of that game. So we'll need to see how that shakes out. But even with Edmonds back, I don't have any hesitation playing Conner. He's going to give you more touchdown upside than just about anybody else in the league. And he's proven that he can get it done in the receiving game. Now, whether he gets the volume with Edmonds out there remains to be seen. But if he can leak out for a couple targets per game, he clearly still has that skill set to get it done. So, yeah, I think you can rely on Conner, and who knows? Arizona might rely a little bit more on using Chase Edmonds in the slot in creative ways. They might rely a little bit more on the ground game with DeAndre Hopkins out. We just don't know. We're going to have to see how it breaks down. But James Conner still is definitely a must-start for me moving forward.
Yeah, especially the way this Arizona offense continues to put up points and find ways to produce, whether Kyler's out there or not, whether Hopkins is out there or not, whether Edmonds is out there or not. You just want pieces in this offense because they play really fast and they dominate teams. They put up fantasy points. And I think you take Conner and Edmonds, it's kind of like the Michelle Henderson situation. They just cap each other, but are definitely worthy of fantasy starts because one guy is going to get that touchdown. It's probably going to be Conner. And so he is the one I would rather put into a lineup right now over Edmonds. But I think Edmonds will give you that 10 to 15 points too, especially in these easy matchups. But let's talk about Seattle. Last team in this NFC West before we get into some wide receiver start sits. Now, they probably have the hardest schedule out of all of these NFC West teams. They have the Rams, the Bears, and then the Lions. If you've been stuck starting Russell Wilson, you're probably going to have to continue to do so if you didn't get one of those premium quarterback streaming options we talked about earlier. You're starting DK, you're starting Lockett just because of the weekly upside they present for you, regardless of matchup. But the one question mark coming off a game that I think shocked all of us, Rashad Penny.
Yeah.
Rashad Penny is getting his fair shot finally in Seattle. He looks to be healthy. At least he's not in crippling pain where he can't run the ball downfield. He's making plays. He's scoring touchdowns for this team. I know it was an easy matchup against the Houston Texans, but is Rashad Penny now a guy that you're flirting with in your RB2 slot?
If I can help it, no. Look, it was great to see the explosive performance from Penny, but you look at his game. I mean, he had 1 reception for 1 yard, so still not – it's never been his forte, never been a huge threat in the receiving game. He can, but he's not someone that's going to be getting 5, 6, 7 targets. And you look at his running line. I mean, 16 carries for 137 yards and 2 touchdowns. He had a 32-yard run and a 47-yard run, 4 touchdowns. So literally, 90% of his production from a fantasy football perspective came on 2 plays. Not saying that can't be
Breaking
done.
news. That's not going to happen against the Rams.
Exactly. Not saying he can't break a long run, but you look at the Rams and you look at Rashad Penny, maybe he breaks 1 long one. I think it's incredibly unlikely and definitely incredibly unlikely that he breaks 2 long runs. Now, if they get in the red zone near the goal line, It could be Rashad Penny, but there's still so many other cooks in the kitchen in that running back room. We don't really know for sure. So I think Rashad Penny coming off of the big game, I think it's more smoke than fire at this point. If you're in an absolute desperation situation, I would still prefer him over some of these other backups in the league. I'd prefer him over probably like a Nyheim Hines. I'd prefer him over a Jeff Wilson, guys like that. But if you can help it, if you have better options, I wouldn't buy all the way into Rashad Penny because there's some volatility there, and you don't want to get burned in the first round of your playoffs.
The only week I really feel good about plugging him into a lineup, and this is just contingent on things remaining constant from a volume and usage standpoint for him over the next 2 weeks, is that fantasy football championship matchup against Detroit, because I don't want any business with him against the Rams, and I don't want any business with him against Chicago. I mean, Chicago's a prime matchup that you go in there, and it's going to be a low-scoring affair. They're going to bottle up the run. I'm not excited. And then you add the fact that the Seahawks offense has been continuously declining as the season's gone on. Back half rust. The memes are real there. And we've talked about that multiple times already on the show. So I think those scoring opportunities are also going to go down until you get to Detroit. So don't fall for the trap that is Rashad Penny. But let's just talk about a few wide receivers. And if we feel like they're ascending or descending down the stretch here, we have 6 names. And the first one, we'll start easy here. I just want to give this guy a shout out because what he's doing is mind-blowing just based on the type of player that he is. It's Hunter Renfrow, man. Hunter Renfrow right now is the wide receiver 12 in PPR. A wide receiver 1. Hunter Renfrow, wide receiver 1.
I love it.
In 2021. Alex, I know this has been a guy that you've been a huge fan of for a while now. Coming off a 27.7 fantasy football outing, 14 targets, before that 10 and 9 targets. He's consistently, even when Henry Ruggs and Bryan Edwards and Darren Waller were all healthy in the lineup, Hunter Renfrow was still seeing 7+ targets a game, man. He is that Cole Beasley, that prime Jarvis Landry. Like, just get this man targets. He's going to bring the ball in. Probably not going to be the most efficient guy in the world after the catch, but he's been getting touchdowns, creating separation off the line of scrimmage. The volume that's opened up for him has just taken his production to a new level, even if the Raiders don't win any games.
Yeah, Renfro's great. I mean, I'm all in on Renfro for like dynasty leagues. Give me all the Hunter Renfro I can get. Give me Hunter Renfro for the rest of this season. Any half PPR, full PPR. I believe that as long as his situation doesn't turn into an absolute train wreck with, you never know what's going to happen with quarterbacks, different teams, free agency, things like that. But Hunter Renfrow, I think, is the next Wes Welker, Julian Edelman. Like, I think he's going to have a spot in the league for a very long time. He's a smart football player, which you can't always teach. He's always working on his craft, his physicality, and his quickness and speed. We've clearly seen him get more and more
special team stud. He
looks the part now. I remember his rookie season, he looked like a little twig out there, and you're like, why is the equipment guy suited up? But now he is really sorry, Hunter, if you're listening, but you've really stepped up, and you can tell he has put on a lot of muscle. He looks the part now. He clearly plays the part, and he's an absolute threat. He's a red zone threat as well, a first down threat in these third and short situations. So I love Hunter Renfrow. Couldn't be more in on him. But Steph, let's move on to the next name you got here. Julio Jones for the Tennessee Titans. The schedule is Pittsburgh, San Francisco, and Miami. The Titans offense has been streaky at best. They've really, really been missing Derrick Henry. They've really been missing A.J. Brown. To me, I think Julio's a fade. I just don't believe in this Tennessee offense right now. They're not moving the ball consistently. I think A.J. Brown might actually open things back up for Julio, but I'm trying to avoid the Titans right now if at all possible. They're just not a team I believe in, and Pittsburgh, San Francisco, Miami isn't necessarily the easiest schedule either.
Yeah, that's why I put Julio on this list, because when you look at the situation, look at the roster right now, you're like, oh, this is a funneled situation. Julio's going to eat, but look at what he did last week in that same situation. Only 4 for 6 targets for 33 yards, no touchdowns. He's only had 1 game with double-digit fantasy points, 0 touchdowns on the year. It's really hard for me. Like, if this was maybe week 5 or 6, I'd be like, hey, maybe we could see things start to open up for him. Maybe some of the pieces were healthy there in Tennessee and they showed a little bit more flash. But we're just not seeing that right now. And for him to go out against Jacksonville and deliver a 7.3 PPR point outing, it just gives you 0 confidence. I'm not expecting in week 15 for Julio to finally have that breakout game since he's come over to Tennessee. So I'm with you. I think he's a fade. I think he's a trap. And I think the next guy on our list, Darnell Mooney. is also a trap. Now, I like him a little bit more as a upside play, a guy that you can put in as a flex boom name with the likes of Christian Kirk and AJ Green and some of the other names that we're going to talk about here in a minute. But the only reason I like him is because he has Minnesota, Seattle, and the Giants. Those are all beautiful matchups. But with Allen Robinson now healthy, back, and active, and passing Mooney in targets, the confidence level on Mooney gets a little bit scary when A-Rob is in the lineup because he just loses 4 to 6 targets that he probably would have gotten otherwise, whether it is Justin Fields or Andy Dalton under center.
It's been a roller coaster ride with him this season. And I think you're right. He's just a boom or bust name. I mean, I think Minnesota,
like at least he has that boom potential that Julio really hasn't given you.
Yeah, I'll take Mooney.
Which is why I'd rather start Mooney over Julio
for sure. Yeah, you kind of do have to see through the name value there. But yeah, I think there's more consistent options, and it's just a prayer at this point in your fantasy football playoffs. If you put Mooney out there, I just would not feel comfortable with that really at all. And Steph, surprisingly, the next name on our list is another guy in that boat with a big name value. Chase Claypool. We saw all the controversy around him after that Minnesota game last week. But Chase Claypool,
it's whatever.
Yeah, I'm not buying into that too much. But Chase Claypool, just from a production standpoint, has been disappointing this season. The touchdowns haven't been there. I think that's a function of the Pittsburgh offense really struggling. The offensive line is in shambles. Big Ben can't throw the ball more than 20 yards down the field, and he has really struggled as well. So, Steph, with Deontay Johnson establishing himself as the clear alpha, with Najee Harris getting a huge workload, with Pat Freiermuth emerging as a red zone threat and a target threat for this offense, what are we doing with Chase Claypool? I would take Claypool over Mooney and Julio. I'd be willing to start him this week in my flex, but I still do think you have to temper expectations. He's got Tennessee this week, Kansas City next week, and then Cleveland to close out the year. I'm feeling really comfortable with him against Kansas City in a high-volume game, but I just don't know. I think the Tennessee-Pittsburgh game could be kind of gross. And if the game script turns out to be, a 20-17 game, I think you could end up disappointed with Chase Claypool this week. But with that being said, still am willing to start him, and I still like him more than Mooney. And
what we know about Claypool this year is that 42-point game that he had as a rookie, like that's just nowhere near within the range of outcomes for him now. That upside is so capped. When you're looking at a flex, I want a guy that can take me over the top. I want that Christian Kirk. I think as we go through more of these options, Kirk becomes one of the clear premium flex names if you're looking at some of these boom bust receivers. We're not talking about guys that are consistently top 20 week over week. With Claypool, he had that 9-target game, 8 for 93 last week, no touchdown. The ceiling is capped, and that's the problem with Claypool. I still like him as a fine streamer option. If you've been stuck having to put him into your lineup, you're probably just going to continue to have to do that because you're not going to find better names on the waiver wire at this point in the season. I think he's good for 12 to 16 fantasy points a week, but yeah, don't get out over your seas on Claypool. So Alex, we're running out of steam here. Last guy that we need to talk about. He's coming off the bye week. Fits into that cap ceiling, but fine flex name. Jacoby Myers. He has the Indianapolis Colts, Buffalo Bills, Jacksonville Jaguars. I think you can plug him in against Jacksonville. I think it's a fine matchup. We know Mac Jones can get the ball to him for sure. Do you feel comfortable starting Jacoby Myers when you're looking at all these other flex receivers that we're talking about against the Colts and against the Bills?
Steph, Jacoby Myers has hurt me too many times this season, and his upside hasn't been there. I mean, he doesn't have the touchdown upside, as we all know very well. His only touchdown of his career was in garbage time from a backup quarterback. So I just think there's better options that give you more upside. He's been in double-digit targets only twice this season. That was kind of like the pull to Jacoby Myers was the target share, the reception total. But with the emergence of Kendrick Bourne, some other options in this offense, I'm just really not excited about Jacoby Myers, and there's tons of other options we've talked about that I'd prefer over him. So I'm sitting him if I can, especially in a middle-of-the-road matchup against the Colts.
Everyone got really excited about Myers in week 3 and week 4 when he saw 14 and 12 targets in back-to-back weeks. Hopefully that's when you sold high because he hasn't reached those peaks since then. I'm honestly fine dropping him and going for an upside name or going for one of these handcuff upside running backs that we talked about earlier in the show, like Samaje Perine, like Devontae Booker, guys that just have that clear path that if the man in front of them goes down, they're going to get all that volume on the ground and through the air. But Alex, that wraps up today's episode. I'm so pumped up for the fantasy playoffs. Let's go win some titles, brother. And you guys can follow along with us. Hit us with those start-sit questions. Let us take a look at your roster. We'll break it all down in the Discord channel. Hit that free link in the description down below. We thank y'all so much for listening and watching. If you like what we do here, like and a sub, greatly appreciated. And we'll see y'all next time. Peace.